Unlike informative speaking, the goal of the persuasive speech is to change the mind or action of your audience. You don't just want to tell them about your topic. Instead, you want them to do something specific that you're telling them to do. Maybe you simply want them to agree with you, or maybe you want them to leave the room in which you are speaking and take action to make a difference in the world. You ask them to vote a certain way, to sign a petition, to boycott a company, to write a letter to their congressional representative, to ride a bike instead of driving a car, to use cloth bags at the grocery store, to buy a hybrid car, to recycle every week, to lead a campaign to bring recycling services to your city. The list of actions you could seek is endless and limited only by your speech topic. Depending on the topic you have chosen, you'll want to choose between the various types of persuasive speeches that your textbook explains. First, there are persuasive speeches that focus on fact. You could persuade your audience that global warming does or does not exist, that abortion is or is not murder, that Pluto is or is not a planet, that Tupac is or is not alive, that Bigfoot is or is not real, etc. As your textbook suggests and these sample topics illustrate, when you decide to do a persuasive speech on a question of fact, you need to decide if you want to deal with a past fact or a current fact or a future fact. In any case, you need to find credible information that persuades the audience in the direction you want to go, and you have to be sure to create a credible and dramatic narrative of how the events in dispute may have happened. If you're discussing a persuasive speech about fact, the only action you likely want from your audience is agreement. You may, however, want them to perform a specific action. Let's say you're talking about Pluto, and maybe you want your audience to write to NASA and demand that Pluto be returned to his rightful place in the solar system. Or maybe you want them to contact an elected representative and tell them what you think about abortion. Usually, though, the action you're seeking from your audience is mainly agreement. Next, there are persuasive speeches that deal with attitudes, beliefs, and values. These speeches focus on persuading your audience that something is good or bad, right or wrong, evil or moral. You could, for example, persuade your audience that homeschooling is or is not beneficial, that the war in Iraq is or is not justified, that abortion is or is not moral, that unions are or are not good for workers. In each of these examples, the central argument revolves around values, things that we as a culture hold true. In each of these cases, too, you are mainly seeking agreement from your audience. Like the speech dealing with fact, however, you may also ask your audience to take a specific kind of action, sign a petition, write a letter, etc. Finally, there are persuasive speeches that deal with action and policy change. These speeches ask your audience to take a very specific action and/or they argue that the government or some other major institution needs to act in a specific way. A personal policy is something your audience can change. Where they shop, how they dress, what they drive, how they bag their groceries, how they drink their water, etc. An institutional policy is something that a regulatory body, the federal government, the state government, local government, the EPA, the FDA, the CDC, the school system, a church group, etc., needs to change. You could persuade your audience that the state government needs to ban cell phones while driving. This is slightly different than persuading them to stop using cell phones while driving, but both are good topics. You could persuade your audience that the federal government should outlaw abortion. Now, this is different than persuading them that they should avoid having abortions. Similarly, you could argue that the government needs to open access to abortion. This is different than persuading them to become advocates for abortion in their hometowns. All of the topics I've just discussed illustrate the difference between institutional and personal policy. The difference, simply put, is who needs to change. In a speech about institutional policy, the government needs to change. In a speech about personal policy, it's your audience who needs to change. As your textbook suggests, persuasive speaking has very different functions than informative speaking. In a persuasive speech, you are directing your audience to make a behavioral or attitudinal choice. You are not simply informing them of their options. You are no longer a teacher, you're an advocate. Your supporting material is not just the speech to educate your audience. Instead, you are using supporting materials to make specific arguments. Your audience members become change agents, not just educated consumers. In return, you ask them to commit strongly to your topic. In a persuasive speech, your credibility is really important because your audience has to trust you and believe that you are knowledgeable before they will take the action you ask of them. In a persuasive speech, you have an even higher ethical obligation to your audience, in part because you are asking them to make a change, and also because you are directly appealing to their feelings as part of the argumentative process. Like the informative speech, you have several options when it comes to organizing your persuasive speech. Your textbook explains them all. The problem-solution design explains a problem and then tells your audience how to solve it. This works well for value speeches and policy speeches. The motivated sequence design, also called Monroe's motivated sequence, is a great design if you are trying to persuade your audience to change their specific behavior. The refutative design is great for a speech on fact because it asks you to challenge other views and explains why yours is the best. Before you choose a method of design for your persuasive speech topic, you need to carefully consider your topic and think about what you are trying to argue and exactly what it is you want the audience to do. Persuasion doesn't happen all at once. Instead, it's a process. We know that people generally like to do what's easiest for them. Changing their attitudes, beliefs, and understandings of the way the world works is not always easy. So people are not inclined to change unless you take them carefully through the incremental process of persuasion. First, you need to make them aware of the topic. Luckily for you, you already accomplished this feat in the informative speech. If you're using the same audience, they're primed for persuasion. Next, you need to help them understand your slant on the topic. You do this early in the speech, the introduction and the first main point. This is where you use evidence, vivid examples, and clear arguments to build your case. Next, you seek their agreement. You do this by telling them exactly what you want them to do and how you want them to act. You ensure that they will follow your advice by demonstrating both enactment, your solution in action, and integration, showing them how they can act in their own lives. As I said earlier, one of the key differences between informative and persuasive speeches is that ethics are even more important in a persuasive speech. This makes sense, right? Because there is more at stake in a persuasive speech. You actually want your audience to change their minds or their behavior, and this is a big deal. To be an ethical persuasive speaker, you must avoid name-calling, be open about your personal interest, make clear that opinions are not facts, and remember that words are powerful and can hurt your audience or entice them to do unethical things. As you can see, like the informative speech, the persuasive speech is concerned with both honesty and responsibility. Again, if you have any questions or concerns about this material, make sure you contact your instructor right away.